Welcome to my teach guide. I titled it Ultimate and Advanced for dramatic effect, and also because there are a lot of teach guides on YouTube, but most of them spend most of their time covering what the cards actually do and some basics and little actual tips on how to get better at Blackbeard. So I'm going to build on those and go a bit more in depth. I will generally assume during the guide that you know what the cards do. I may reiterate for a specific definition just to highlight some potential plays or upsides and downsides, but generally I have some faith that you know what's going on. The video length is daunting, so let's just get started with a table of contents. I already did the introduction. I'm going to follow up with some things for outside of the game, then move on to broad ideas for general gameplay, the leader ability, which requires some detail due to its importance, the cards in detail by category, general deck building, what the current plan is in the current meta, the curves, whether even or odd, what we search for and what we're willing to trash, the 5 most common matchups at the moment in detail, and then some common mistakes, great teach versus a good teach, how to improve, and finally, conclusion. We're going to continue with our first point, outside the game. So what I mean by that is that even before you're in an individual match with an opponent, there are a couple of things you can do in practice that are important to increase your chances then. The first one is going to be game knowledge. Leaderability defines teach as a leader, obviously, somewhat self-explanatory wise. Um, but it requires you to know what your opponent plays in their deck, what their important on plays are, and when you have to turn it off, and when you can afford to not turn off the on plays. You're aiming to minimize the amount of times you have to use it. And so outside of the game, you need to look into and research what the most common meta decks are playing. Next up, for your deck list, it needs to be variable and it needs to be meta dependent, because as a reactive deck that tries to negate our opponent's game plan, we need to be ready for specifically the decks that we end up playing against, so we want to maximize our chances against the decks that are currently in the meta. And the details of that change over time, and so you need to be ready to change your deck list without getting too comfortable with it. Lastly, this is somewhat in-game, but getting used to counting cards. So as you cycle through your deck, you're going to start to theoretically know what cards should be coming up because you place them at the bottom of the deck. And even if you don't fully know everything, you should at least try and keep track of things like how close you're to your next 10 cost teach or your 5 cost Kuzan. Very broadly, going into the general gameplay plan, go first when you're playing the KO version of the deck, as currently is the case, and second whenever you're playing a more Burgess and Blackbeard focused approach. That's because, of course, the KO version works smoothly on turns 5 and 7, and the Burgess and 10 costs want to be dropped as efficiently as possible. Exception to that is that you always want to go first against almost every purple deck because their ramp starts at the 3 dawn, and if you can delay that, it makes a huge difference. But there's also some decks where you would prefer to go second even when you're playing a KO version, such as the Rayleigh at the moment. I will go into those a bit in the matchups. Second, you want to plan your game. What I mean by that is that once you have your starting hand, and especially once you're looking at what do I want to search, you need to be thinking ahead 2 turns at least to see what you're going to be playing, what your opponent might play, and how you're going to respond to that. And that's especially important in Teach because you need to be trashing cards from your hand, which means you need to know what you're going to need in the future depending on what your opponent plays. And so if you're thinking, okay, my opponent does thing 1, I play answer A. If my opponent does thing 2, I play answer B. It's important that when that moment comes, you have answer A and B ready, and so you don't trash either of them, especially if you can't find them again using a searcher. So the planning becomes more important because you're constantly cutting out options for yourself using your trashing. Hit-wise, take the first hit, you have 5 life, you're a control deck. you need the cards to protect your other cards, your characters, and also to find the key components you need. Whether you take the second or third hit varies. Second, you can also often comfortably take for the hand size, and the third, maybe, if your opponent is playing a very slow deck and you're confident that you can protect yourself using blockers and by clearing the enemy board. Generally, if you have 3 life or more, if a 7k swing comes in, you're just going to take it. Uh, the only exception to those general rules are if you're playing against a very aggressive deck. The example that comes to mind here at the moment is Rayleigh. Even at 5 life, it can be worth dropping 1 card. And generally, if you're up against an aggressive deck of some sort, if you can save a life by dropping 1 card, it's usually worth it. As a control deck, you always want to focus board with your swings. Whether it's your leader or Burgess or whatever you may have. But it's not worth to starve enemy decks. Again, Rayleigh comes up. Um, the the threat you get of actually being able to kill your opponent relatively suddenly with your big attacks later, potentially a double attack, and the board that you build up is a lot scarier if your opponent is at 3 or 2 life than if they are at 5 life. Because that way you can kill them in 1 to 2 turns, which leaves them less time to just attack you without worry. So for the Rayleigh, for example, if he has 5 life, he can just decide, you have 1 life, I'm going to swing 15,000 phase twice in a row. I'm not going to play any cards on the board, I'm just going to swing and I know that you can't kill me because I'm too healthy. And to prevent that type of situation, take lives when you can. Try and take those just kind of gradually while you're moving for the board, and then you can unexpectedly go for the kill because your high swings are hard to count out of. Lastly, in general, it's just important to know and keep in mind, aside from the on plays you're negating, keep in mind what removal and rush your enemy may have to suddenly swing how many attacks they can get through, right? So generally you can do the math, okay, I have 2 blockers and 1 life, my opponent has 3 attacks, they can't kill me, right? Even if I can't counter out of anything. But a rusher changes that equation, removal changes that equation, and you always need to keep that in mind. Next up, the leader ability. This is a core part of Blackbeard and the defining aspect of this deck. And to use it well, you need to know the deck that you're playing against, and you need to know what cards you need to prevent, and how much value they bring with them. That means memorizing deck lists of decks that you're not playing, especially the meta ones that you're more likely to play against. And you can start with just the biggest ones, or a very rudimentary guideline of against blue purple Luffy, I turn off on play starting at 9 dawn. But for a more detailed and accurate approach, you'll need to know exactly which cards and when you may be able to leave it open. It is definitely a higher skill part of Teach, and even in matchups that you're used to, it can require serious thought each turn. When things are close and you really don't want to lose cards, how much will I lose if they do end up having that on play? Since you do lose a card, you always have to weigh it against what your opponent loses in turn. So for example, the simplest example, if you negate a search, that means you both lose a card. Or rather, you lose a card and he does not gain one. Here you have the advantage that you denied a search, and so he had less options there, and you got rid of something you don't need as much. However, that does only apply if they actually play the on-play searcher, despite you using the leader ability. In general, on-plays are tempo. Sometimes they're also card draw, but usually they're tempo of one way or another. And so we're using cards from our hand to sacrifice to slow down enemy tempo, similar to how we might counter out of a swing, which loses us cards from hand but keeps our board stronger. The more powerful and tempo swinging the on play is, the more value we get from a leader ability. If, of course, your opponent has alternatives to their on play that are not on play, then they lose less in comparison. So if we negate leader ability and for 2 Dawn they play a 2-cost Searcher, then we traded that 1 for 1. But if instead of that on-play Searcher they have a different 2-cost they can play, like Rayleigh with an activate main Sanji, he now did not have to play a weaker turn. He was able to use it just as effectively, and you have, in a way, wasted a card, but that's not always the case because even if he now had a turn without problem and it feels slightly worse, he may have still had that double on play to make, and it was probably still the right decision. But you're always contemplating how much is my opponent going to lose if they cannot make this optimal play. And that's also why you're comparing, will they play the on play anyways, which they will in specific scenarios, something like a Cavendish that has an on play but also an on attacking effect, or Rayleigh that wants the 1 costs, or even just something like a 5 cost Tachigi in Zoro, where your opponent just wants to get the body on board, even if they don't get the effect off. Lastly, sometimes you you have the freedom to balance the power of the on play they may get with the chance of them having a card. So for example, at 4 Dawn, Blue Purple Luffy can play the on play ramp from Bon Clay. But there's only a 30% or so chance that he actually has that Bon Clay in hand, so we save ourselves the card and leave it open and hope that he doesn't have it on hand. And that type of thinking applies in many different situations against many decks. And if Bond does get through, it's not the end of the world for us. However, there are times when, even if a certain card is unlikely, the fact that if they do get it off, we lose or lose way too much of our board means that we have to continuously use leader ability, even if we lose cards and even if maybe they don't even have that card. An example for this would be the 7 cost Hody if you have blockers active, or a 10 cost Doflamingo freezing your entire board even if your opponent only has 1 card in hand. We sometimes just cannot afford to have that possibility. A last bit is that if you have a Burgess and you're trying to close out the game, remember to drop your entire hand with your leader ability for Burgess, since it doesn't have a once per turn clause. So if you have 21 cards in your trash and you have 7 cards in hand, your opponent may be expecting that 10,000 Burgess swing at the end, but you drop all 7 cards and he goes to 12,000, and that can lead to some kills that are otherwise not possible. It's a niche thing, but it is fun to do. We are going to start with the core cards, the first of which is obviously going to be the 10 cost Teach. As a control deck, our 10 cost is a lot of what we build and play towards. If we get to 10 and start being able to play multiple of these, we are generally going to win. Having 12,000 attack as a blocker means that once a turn we can dodge any swing if he's active without losing any resources, and often we can use it to block the biggest swing that they have instead of just a smaller one, as smaller blockers might be able to cover. As he stuns on play and blocks an attack, he practically equates to 2 extra life if we're in a situation where we're at threat of getting actually killed. And so he has a lot of immediate impact, despite also then being an absolute threat on board once you can start swinging with him. On the note of which, once he is on board, don't be afraid to just keep swinging with him as soon as you can. Unless you're in threat of getting killed, it's always worth it to get those 12,000 swings off, either to clear the board or to start hitting uncounterable hits at the enemy life that will leave your enemy dead in 1 to 2 turns. Downsides for Teach, it is not as strong if he's dropped onto an empty board from your side. He is much stronger if he has cards to support him. Having a Burgess is nice, but also smaller blockers, so that once your Teach is rested, your opponent cannot attach all their Dawn or just onto a big unit and swing to kill him. He becomes a lot scarier if you have cards to support him, so that if your opponent decides, I want to swing 16,000 into this teach and get rid of him, there's a small little 1 cost, 4 cost, 5 cost blocker that just denies that fully and puts your opponent into a lose-lose situation. The other case where you might have him as a weakness is in early game and situations where you're playing against an aggro deck. In those cases, Teach is too slow. Don't worry about trying to survive aggro so you can play him on 10 and swing the game. That's all too slow. Trash him as soon as you can. Don't pick him up for searches. Just focus on the early game. And in those cases, Teach is not what we're working towards. But in general, Teach is an extremely strong card. It's what we're working towards. And as soon as you close onto 10 Dawn, especially if you're on the even curve, it's a priority pickup. Against matchups where that are generally a control mirror, he becomes the most important card because there is very, very few cards that can outvalue 10 cost Teach as an individual card. The only one that comes to mind potentially would be 10 cost Shanks. Multiple Shanks against multiple Blackbeards can be rough. We continue on with our second main win condition, which will be Burgess. Burgess was the core when the deck first came out. Being able to scale up to such big amounts later on where you can potentially drop 2 of him in the same turn and start building up a board very early that then becomes a very hard to kill monster to win you the game. Whether you're using it to control the board by swinging high into enemy lower cost units that would usually be able to defend themselves with a counter or would usually require you to spend resources to swing that high, Burgess does it for free while eating attacks and being much easier to counter. He's also strong early on against aggro decks sometimes. People may recommend that, oh, before Burgess hits 8, 9, don't rest him because now he'll be a target and your opponent can clear him easier. While that is true, he is more difficult to kill than you are. So in matchups where you don't want to be losing a lot of life, which is basically any aggro type of deck, momentarily that might be Rayleigh, Zoro, stuff like that, it can be advantageous to have him rested because if your opponent wants to swing into a 7,000 attack, it's going to take more resources and it's going to be easier for you to defend. So swing with him all you like and try to build him up, especially to have 1 or 2 ready for when the 10 cost teaches start dropping. When it comes to weaknesses, Burgess has no impact on the turn that he is played. So he doesn't do anything to swing the tempo your way right away. So if you're already losing quite hard and heavily behind in tempo, he can be a bit too slow. But usually you have enough time, especially if you've previously protected yourself a bit by having other blockers or just having enough life. And the second weakness he has is that in combination or due to not having immediate impact, he is very vulnerable to removal. Most removal is KO, so he dodges that, or somehow based on attack, which he also dodges because he'll be at quite high attack pretty soon. And if you rest him, he can still be defended quite well. But against the few removals that do work against him, he can be seemingly very weak. Gravity Blade hurts a lot if you're getting rid of 2 of your win conditions, but currently the most problematic card for him is the 8 cost Rush Luffy that's played in Blue Purple Luffy. Being able to bounce a 4 cost to hand avoids his protection and costs the Luffy basically nothing. It can't be prevented using leader ability and it can be done once per turn, which is why going for a Burgess heavy deck and build or just gameplay against Blue Purple is impossible. He will bounce your Burgesses to hand and win the game single-handedly. And that is generally what decides how strong Burgess is or how strong a deck focused around Burgess is going to be. How easily can your opponent remove the Burgess? At the moment in 11 and 12, Blue Purple Luffy can do it effortlessly. Zoro can rest him and swing big into him early on without losing resources because he's going to 8,000 anyways, so he can't really afford to defend it. He gets rested by the 4-cost Tashigi. And so because he's easy to remove in the current meta, the focusing on him as a deck building doesn't work so well. As soon as that changes, Burgess will be a bigger priority again. And then we move on to the last core card, which is Kuzan. Kuzan is probably the strongest individual card in the deck, even if he isn't a win condition by himself. He makes all your other cards stronger. The ability to play any of your other mid-game, early game Blackbeard cards while also drawing you a card is incredibly powerful. If not for nothing else, that he's the only direct card draw in your deck, he allows you to keep playing cards, especially later on when you have 1 to 2 cards in your hand. You might reach a situation where you have no more cards in hand, and you're drawing at 10 dawn and you draw a card, and either you play a card or you use leader ability and you can't do both. And that's a loss-loss situation a lot of the time, depending on what you're up against. And Kuzan fixes that. If you find a Kuzan with stage or with draw, then you can play him, get yourself a Burgess, get yourself a blocker, and still have a card to trash. Or if you have a bit more, still have a card to trash and some counter in hand. Kuzan keeps you alive in those later stages, and early on he also gets you out what you want without losing a card. And so yeah, he's just the most important card in the deck when it comes to flexibility and managing your hand size. For a bit more detail, it's often worth it to keep Kuzan on the board for 1 turn. The advantage of that is that since he can't be removed, he can get a free swing in, or he won't be removed, and then on your turn you can get a free swing and then switch to the character you want. This will most commonly apply to Augur, since Augur can use his reduction on the turn that he's played, so you don't lose anything by it. If you were to example play Kuzan, trash him right away to grab an Augur, and you're only trying to KO things next turn, now your Augur is vulnerable to KO effects that Kuzan wouldn't be, and you get 1 swing less. So that's something to keep in mind, where if you don't right away need the card that you're going to be playing with Kuzan, you can leave the Kuzan on board for a bit, give yourself that flexibility, and also dodge some removal like Gravity Blade. So for example, if you want to play 2 Burgesses and you're up against a blue deck, it can be safer to play 1 Burgess and leave 1 Kuzan on the field so that he can't remove them both. And then next turn, you turn this Kuzan into a Burgess as well and drop a 10-cost Teach or something, and now he can't remove everything in 1 turn, and it would take too much for him, and you just have a stronger lead. That's most of it. The only ways he really can be removed is by resting, and so if your opponent does have a rest effect that hits Kuzan, you have to keep that in mind and have to see if you have to play around it, but that's very rare. Something like Quina doesn't hit 5 costs. Something like the 5-cost Quina is on play, so you can negate it. And Dead Man's Game, which is the only real thing that comes to mind, is quite expensive to use on just a Kuzan early on. But it is something to keep in mind. Some people will be willing, if you play Kuzan on 5, to on 6 Dawn, for example, use Deadman's, rest him, and swing 7 into him, especially if they have a board and can add some additional swings. So do be aware of that. But in general, he's incredibly strong. Use him to play any other card instead of just playing the other card. And late game, he can be a stronger pick than the 10-cost Teach, just because possibly you can play 2, but just keeping the hand size is core. And yeah, that covers the core cards for now. I'm going to move on. Next, we're going to move on to the searchers. We're going to start with Stage. Stage is basically another core card, but I put it here since it's also part of this lovely category. The Stage finds everything in our deck. It fills our trash for Burgess and for targets for Kuzan. It fixes any hand we may have because, of course, we can fix one card per turn, but also we have the leader ability to get rid of other undesirable things. So if we have a stage in our starting hand, anything else is acceptable because we can fix anything. Finding this early is a core component of whether you're going to win the game or not. It's not always as essential, but it's always great to have. Um, yeah, so the only downside to stage is that it does go -1. So when you play it, it itself does nothing, and every time you want to gain a card, you lose a card. So this is a -1, and that can be relevant. Usually it's outweighed by filling your trash and finding the cards you need. But in some situations, like against aggro decks where you don't have a turn 1, or just in general decks later when you find it very late and you're at higher dawn amounts, uh, it may not be worth it to play the card because you do go -1, and then we'll have to trash maybe a more useful card like a Teach or a Kuzan or other blocker later on, and the Surge kind of loses its value. And in those cases, you may just want to trash it. So it's important to know that later on. Keep in mind it's a -1, maybe just get rid of it. We continue on to our second searcher, which is the Lafitte. Lafitte is an amazing card. He's a standard activate main searcher, which just happens to be a bit better in our deck than in others. So yeah, so we go through more of our deck, 5 additional cards together with stage. He's the reason why we can see so much of our deck and all of our deck probably, and include one-ofs and two-ofs. He works as a pseudo blocker, so even though we already get one search off and have to pay 2 for it instead of 1, your opponent is forced to use a swing on it. He will rarely live to use the ability twice, but he doesn't need to because eating that one 5000 swing saves you a counter, saves you a life. The only way that where that doesn't happen is if your opponent has a weak 1 cost or 2 cost unit to kill it with, in which case we do lose that value of eating a swing, and that is always unfortunate. Lafitte also has the possibility of our ideal play, which does not actually include stage. If we're going first, the dream start is to play Lafitte on 1. Your opponent doesn't play anything on their 2-don turn. Most people will try to play searchers, which is why if you play Lafitte on turn 1, use your leader ability, even if your opponent, even if you might otherwise not, just to discourage your opponent from playing their 1-cost searchers. And so then if he is left alone on the following turn, you want to activate his effect, and then find another Lafitte and play and activate the other Lafitte. You get to go through 10 cards of your deck, and now you have 2 of these pseudo blockers on the field, which your opponent cannot clear in 1 turn. He needs to use a leader swing on it, kill one of them, he plays something else, you activate the Lafitte again then or later. You have gotten 3 cards from the searchers, seen 15 cards from your deck, and have also eaten 2 attacks that would otherwise require a 1k counter. So in total, that is 5 cards that you have gained, so to speak, for 2 and 5 done. And that is absolutely fantastic in Teach. The fact that you can turn off on plays also protects him and makes 1 cost that would otherwise negate his value less likely. And so he's an amazing card. I would always play this at 4, even if some people sometimes go down to 3. Just keep it up. There are later situations when it can be better to not play him, because even after you activate the effect, if you're reaching 10 Dawn, you may just need that 10 Dawn. If your plan is to play 10 cost Teaches, then Lafitte becomes useless on board, and that's something that can be worth it to keep in mind. But yeah, we continue. Last and least is my age. My age only gets us through 3 and only once. but its main advantage is that it is a burst in trash. So for Burgess, this one done card adds 3 cards to your trash, while of course also searching further. It also has a trigger to do the same effect, which can help us when we're getting attacked for game to find that extra 2k, or just earlier on to fill the trash and find us the cards we need. Is generally a good inclusion. It's never going to drop to 0, but you're also rarely going to be playing it at 4. It is a searcher for consistency, so it's generally a good card, but it falls short of both stage and of Lafitte. And later on, it's often going to be a brick in hand because it messes with your curve without getting you much value. And so later on, you're often just going to be trashing this for leaderability or stage. Yeah, that covers the searchers. We're going to continue on. Now we get to the KO engine. One of the ways the deck wins, or one of the ways the deck stalls towards a later stage where we can win with the 10 cost Teach and Burgess, is using the KO engine. The first part of that is the 2 cost Q. When first played on curve, for example, it can get rid of a 1 cost, which can absolutely be worth it, even though Q wants to be used for higher combos with Augur to shoot 4 costs and 3 costs that may be dropped. Shooting 1 cost can be worth it because it removes one way for them to kill the Q easily. Q also works as a pseudo blocker, similar to Lafitte. And so if you do decide to use Q later, you don't activate him right away, and you combine him with Augur, then he will be killed by the 1 cost your opponent played, and thus lose you that pseudo blocker part. But it can be worth it to leave active if you know you have a priority target you're gonna want to kill with Augur. The removal of 1 cost also works nicely with the Lafitte start. So if you played Lafitte on 1 dawn and then on 3 dawn you activate the Lafitte and play the Q to kill the 1 cost they played, to avoid them killing either your Lafitte or your Q with that cheap swing. And this also puts your opponent in an unfortunate situation where they have to decide, am I going to kill the Doc or am I going to kill the Lafitte? Am I going to give him free cards or am I going to allow him to keep up this KO engine? And oftentimes they will choose to kill the Lafitte. Q is also a bit discouraging since he draws you a card, and so that can be something you should generally lean towards to kill the 1 cost when played. We continue on to the second part of the KO engine and kind of the glue that drops it, but binds it together, which is Augur. Augur is just lovely, reliable cost reduction. Together with Doc, he puts 4 costs into range, and with additional reduction like stronger Tempest Kick or further Augurs, higher things can be KO'd. And having Augur on board always threatens that as soon as you add another KO mechanic, as soon as you add a more cost reduction, anything your opponent plays may just be killed. And so he too works as a pseudo blocker, just significantly harder to kill. If your opponent decides to kill this, especially when it's played relatively early on, he'll probably have to attach Dawn to go into something like an 8k swing. And even at an 8k swing, for us, it can be completely worth it to defend him. And to just keep that pressure on board, your opponent will have used their Dawn to attack, will have developed less, we protect the Augur, we play more of the engine, and their board is empty, and they're gonna need to go through the same decisions again. Amazing card. Since he's 5 cost, he can also be played with Kuzan, which means he can be played while gaining a card, and of course also gains 1 on death. Yep, just lovely. Even without a KO engine, he's a decent card as a 6k swing that replaces himself, even if he becomes a lot weaker. Strong card in the KO engine and even without. And we continue to the third and last part of the KO engine, which is the 7 cost Teach. KOing a 3 cost allows you to just by himself get rid of a lot of inconvenient cards. These will generally be stuff like low cost blockers, cards that protect other cards like the Tashigi or the Kyoshiro, for example. Or even if you somehow have the chance to play him against more aggressive decks, this can also get rid of things like Rush Zoro or any other aggro cards you might be thinking of. And in combination with Augur being able to shoot 6 costs, especially 5 costs, they're often very strong, whether it be Cavendish or Carrot or Smoker or anything else. He puts a lot of things into range, and if you add Augur and one more cost reduction, such as Tempest Kick or a second Augur, he can hit 9 costs and 8 costs, which is basically any strong opponent you may be playing against, and that combo of double Augur Teach or Augur Teach Tempest Kick is also your main strategy against something like Blue Purple Luffy to be able to KO whatever they play while having a board and forcing your opponent to invest to actually try to kill it. With an 8,000 attack line, he's difficult to swing into. As a valuable card, your opponent knows that if they swing less than 10,000, you're going to drop one card and protect it. And even if they swing for 10,000 and use half their turn to kill him, you may very well counter out of it. And then they wasted their turn and this thing is still alive. And so if they really want to get rid of it, they'll probably be swinging very high, 12,000 for example, or if you have little cards in hand. And then you're content to just let it go because that's going to be happening at a point where you're at 10 done. And so you can grab yourself a 10 cost Teach to just follow up on it. Just in general, for the KO effect, the main targets are going to be the 10 cost Teach and the 5 cost Kuzan. 10 cost Teach just because you're going to be proccing this when you are at 10 done and can get you back a Teach you may have trashed earlier when you didn't need him. And the alternative is a 5 cost Kuzan so that you can either play 2 or just use it to draw a card and grab a blocker, grab a Burgess just for the value. Excellent card either way. As soon as you have one, you can trash any additional ones you find because if he dies and you really need him, he can just pick himself to grab back to hand. Most of the time that won't happen though. If you have one, you can get rid of any additional ones you have. And lastly, he's still an 8,000 attack, and so sometimes it can be worth it to just swing. If there is a rested target that you could KO with Augur and Teach together, just swinging once with Teach can be enough to kill it. And sometimes you just want to go life anyways, because that 8,000 attack line brings your opponent a lot closer to range of things like Burgess or attached on for lethal. So don't forget that aside from being an KO engine, he's also just a strong big swing. Those are the main cards of the KO engine, and it is how we win against a lot of decks that where Burgess and Teach may be too slow, because these cards have immediate impact. They also all replace themselves, so it never feels as bad when they do die. Doc Q is crucial against aggro decks, especially combined with Augur later on. Teach brings a scary engine with Augur, and even if they kill something, if you for example have Augur and Teach set up, they will probably target the Augur, and you can follow up by just playing a new Augur from hand with a Kuzan. Lastly, I do want to note that they also work beautifully on curve. What I mean by that is if you have Doc set up on say 3 down, and on 4 down your opponent plays something, then the 5 cost Augur will combine with Doc to shoot the 4 cost they played. And if they then KO the Doc and play a 6 cost on their 6 down turn, Augur and Teach combine to perfectly shoot that 6 cost. And that curve is what makes your odd curve, your uneven curve, very scary sometimes. I'm going to continue on to the two other parts of the KO engine that aren't as crucial. First, Laboon. Laboon was more common in past sets, mostly because we didn't have 7 cost Teach and we had less other good options. Laboon, in comparison to Augur, gives -1 additional cost and is also 1 cheaper. That extra KO range can be important for specific cards, Most notably, Dock Q and Laboon together can shoot 5 costs, which are, as I mentioned before, an important target that may need to be killed as soon as possible. And Augur Dock can't hit them, and you would need to find something else to add. Tempest Kick may not be online yet, another Augur may be too slow, and you end up unable to remove the 5 cost and forced to let them use their abilities for a turn or even 2. And theoretically, Laboon could fix that. Together with another Augur and the 7 cost Teach, he could hit 10 cost, which is a very, very high thing to kill, even if it requires a combo. That is about where the upsides end. Laboon isn't played at all anymore, or at least, you know, something to consider as a tech option at best, and that's because despite costing 1 less, he's much easier to remove. As a 5000 attack, once you use him to rest something, he will be a pseudo blocker, but he'll probably die to a 5000 swing, at highest a 7000 swing. You don't want to use your resources to protect him as much, especially if your opponent has multiple swings on it. So this will generally die after the first use. Unlike Augur, it does not replace itself with a draw, and unlike Augur, it also cannot be brought back from the trash using Kuzan. So a Kuzan into Augur versus a Laboon is 2 cards more for you, and the Laboon will just easily die. What that equates to a lot of the time is that the Laboon turns into a 4-Don -4 effect with the pseudo blocker effect added. And that just isn't as impressive. You're mostly going to be getting things into range with your other cost reduction just fine. And while this may be worth considering in some situations, it's generally not going to be worth including. The other part, the other outside option for the KO engine is Tempest Kick. For 1, we can reduce something by 3. And because it replaces itself, it doesn't feel bad to use as cost reduction as Stronger might feel bad. And the -3 lets you put a lot of things into range. It lets you replace an Augur rest basically. And in a niche situation where you don't have enough time to build up your Augurs or other cost reduction, this can unexpectedly put things into KO range that otherwise might have been safe. So even if you have nothing on board, a Teach into a Tempest Kick can KO a 5 cost your opponent played. Or if you do have an Augur, of course, now you can hit basically anything. It also has a nice trigger, which is worth including. So if you're playing the KO engine, Tempest Kick is generally worth including. Early on, you can also just cycle it if you have bricks in hand and need to find a way to get through more of your deck. So it isn't as dead early on as well. Even if it doesn't fit onto your curve, it's just a brick. If you're not playing the KO engine, it's not worth it. But if you are, it's a good card to include. In some metas, you might actually just include this as a 4 of, such as against Blue Purple Luffy. So in order of basically the 3 Teach cards are the core of the engine, and these other 2 are options to consider, with Tempest Kick being the only one that's really valid at the moment. I'm going to move on to the blockers. We're going to start pretty straightforward with Devon, the oldest one. Blackbeard has multiple valid blockers, and which one you choose depends a bit on flavor, a bit on the current meta. Devon is 5 base cost, which lets you dodge some of the KOing and restrictions that may apply to Wolf and Shiryu, since they are both increase their cost but have a base of 4. It also has 6000 attack, which means that it can block 5k swings without actually dying. And what makes Devon stand out is the threat of double attack. If you use her as a blocker, or you just play her as a blocker and then don't block with her, you can threaten for game in games where that would otherwise be impossible. Even if your opponent doesn't have a lot of cards, if you just don't have enough swings on board to go for game, then you can't win. But this Devon changes that. And if you have a Burgess setup, maybe even a Teach, depending on where you are, or just a 7-cost Teach and some blockers, being able to suddenly swing for 11,000 double attack face, putting your opponent suddenly into death range, that can win you games, and that's why Devon is always worth considering, and I would generally put her off as a one of, just so that if the time does call for it, you can bring her back with Kuzan, and you do want some amount of blockers. Since she is unable to increase her cost, she does get killed by some cost-based removal. So that's worth considering. Which of the blockers is safer will depend on what deck you're up against. That brings us to the second one, Shiryu. He's pretty new, but he's amazing. He's 8 cost through increase, and so he basically avoids any cost-based removal. That means you can play him safely without worrying that your blocker is going to be removed, and so he reliably works as an extra life, which is one of the most important things when playing a blocker, is the confidence that they're not going to be removed by an effect and you get killed anyways. As mentioned before, as a 4-cost base, he is vulnerable to the 4-cost Quina and also himself, oddly enough, and Black Hole, since it first reduces his cost increase. But other stuff like Gravity Blade or general bounces that exist, this dodges those. His KO effect is amazing against aggro decks, just because you block one attack and then kill another. He's great tempo in that way. And against things like the current Rayleigh, having this Shiryu early on, especially if you can bring him back with Kuzan for the draw and the repeated use, can win you the game. It is especially potent if your opponent has multiple 4-cost or lower characters, because if your opponent is not stupid and they have one 4-cost or below character and you have Shiryu, they will first swing with that 4-cost, and so you block it and KO them, but you do not actually prevent that 4-cost swing. So when it comes to that turn in particular, he worked basically as a normal blocker without the effect. However, if your opponent has multiple targets, then when he swings with the first, you block it and KO the second one, countering both the original swing and preventing a second one. And those are the situations where Shiryu really shines. Generally, momentarily, that's against Rayleigh, but also if in the niche situation against blue-purple where they play a double bond clay, this perfectly answers both of them in one go. And he will remain an important contender as a blocker, at least as a one-of in most metas, just so that you can bring him back against the right one with Kuzan. Weakness-wise is mostly just that he has 5,000 attack compared to the 6,000 of Wolf and Devon. That means that any attack that you would want to block, he will need to die for. And so you can never just block with him without him dying. And you do want him dying a lot of the time, but it is worth noting. And there are a lot of situations where if there are no targets, he's just objectively worse than the other ones. We move to the last of the below 5 cost blockers, Wolf. Wolf came out at an odd time, a solid amount behind the original Devon, and not that long before the new Shiryu release. And Wolf, both of the other ones do something better than Wolf does. Shiryu has the better cost increase because it's instant, and Wolf requires setup and may get removed before he reaches a point where he can dodge cost-based removal. There is basically nothing that would hit an 8 cost that wouldn't hit a 9 or 10 cost when Wolf reaches that point. And he also lacks the bonus abilities of Devon. So Wolf is generally inferior, and when you're picking your blockers, you're generally going to be choosing between Shiryu and Devon and how many of each you want to put in. There may be cases where specifically Wolf shines, maybe as a one of, or a meta where his specific combination is the way to go, but currently your options for the 4 and 5 cost blockers will be Devon and Shiryu. Oftentimes at least one of each so that you have the flexibility with Kuzan. The last blocker to cover here is the 6 cost Kuzan. The 6 cost Kuzan is amazing for value. Being able to, similarly to the 5 cost Kuzan, grab another Blackbeard card is great. He can bring a lot of value by bringing the 5 cost Kuzan out so that you can, from the 6 cost, block an attack, go into the 5 cost, get a free attack with him, trash him, and then grab another blocker, grab a Burgess, whatever you may need, and get an extra card that way. And alternatively, he can also just bring out a Burgess straight away so that you can swing with him on the turn after. In a very niche situation, you may be able to bring out the Devon as kind of a surprise attack where your opponent isn't expecting the Katarina and isn't ready to play around her double attack. Generally though, your ideal target is going to be Kuzan, especially early on when Burgess isn't that big yet, and if not that, then Burgess. He, since Kuzan is vulnerable as a rest at 5 cost, you're going to want to block with the 6 cost Kuzan on the last opponent's swing, so that he doesn't have any swings left to kill the Kuzan. If you need to block earlier, just grab the Burgess, in which case you don't have to worry about that because he's too big of a target to be casually swung into. Yeah, so downsides for the Kuzan are that he's relatively slow. Early on, you don't have the time, and his 6,000 stat line means that as a 6 cost, he's not much of a threat and he dies relatively quickly. And early on, you might just want to be playing other things. Because he's a 6 cost, it also means that at 10 Dawn, you cannot combine him with the 5 cost Kuzan, who's often going to be a priority target for playing right away. And so you might just prefer to play the 5 cost Kuzan twice, or the 5 cost Kuzan and the Burgess, or another 4 cost blocker, instead of playing the 6 cost Kuzan and not having the 5 cost Kuzan option. He still works nicely when combined with the 4 cost blockers or Burgess, but it is something worth noting. You're rarely going to play more than one of these because the timing needs to be just right for him to work. But if he does, he can get you a lot of value, he can get you a lot of tempo, and it's a strong card to include at least as a one of. Yeah, that generally covers it. Most of the time you're going to include 1 to 2 Kuzans and then somewhere between 2 and 4 blockers chosen from these, usually Devon and Shiryu. We continue on to individual removals. This is basically removal that isn't part of the KO engine, and you're often going to be playing this individually, um, often because it's just KOs based on base cost, and others just because it does its job individually as an activate main event. We're going to start with the most important and strongest one, which is Black Hole. Black Hole is a unique card in the game, and there's no removal like it. Being able to negate the effect of a character before KOing a 4 cost means that you can get around a lot of protection. Of course, it dodges any immunity, whether it's the KO immunity from Burgess or the complete immunity that something like Kuzan or the upcoming 5 Elders may have. It dodges that. It also dodges KO effects that can be very painful. The yellow ones come to mind here in particular, like Kikinoju or the Basil Hawkins, or this can cleanly remove without losing or giving a life here. The 6 cost Kuma can also be removed cleanly with this, which means that in combination with denying its on play, Teach is actually the only deck that can cleanly remove Kuzan without your opponent actually ever gaining a life. It also gets around cost increase cards by first reducing their cost and then KOing them. So for example, the forecast hack from Koala, let's say, increases its cost by 4, as does our Shiryu actually. And it'll first negate that, so it goes back to being a forecast, and then KO it. And you can also combine that with cost reduction first, in case they're a higher level target, and that works out as well. So Black Hole is an amazing card for getting rid of things that are otherwise difficult to kill. Mm, However, when it's not killing things that are difficult to remove like that, it's generally going to be worse than just shooting something with the Augur Dock combo, since you don't get any board for it, and the Augur and Dock will replace themselves and stay on the board to be able to use multiple times. That's why you'll generally want to have one of this, but probably not a lot more, because in most matchups it doesn't have that direct effect, but in those where it does, it's incredibly powerful. The last thing I want to cover with Black Hole is that it negates keywords on the card that you're using it on. Most notably, and only relevantly really, is blocker. You can use this to negate blocker on a character, and then even if it doesn't kill them, you can ignore that blocker and go for game. And that's kind of the, the third use of this, to just find it towards the end of the game, either with your stage, maybe desperately with a 7 cost teach grab. If you know you're going for game, Black Hole is the way to go. You can, for 4 Dawn, get rid of any blocker without having to use your, for example, Augur Arrest, and can just swing with Augur. And there's also the niche situation where your opponent has Paradise Waterfall on a higher cost blocker, so like Mihawk for example. Paradise Waterfall is a counter event that restands the character. So you use a swing, he blocks with the Mihawk, and uses Paradise Waterfall, and the Mihawk gets restanded right away and will be able to block another attack. And Black Hole gets around that by just first negating the blocker, and he's never going to be able to restand it using Paradise Waterfall. This is one of the best cards to go for game, and it will always either be in your deck or an extremely strong contender to have in your deck. And if you don't need it at the moment, cycle it out and prepare to grab it later when necessary. Next up is Liberation. So Liberation is more niche. KOs a 6 and a 4 cost by base, but it is very situational since it requires you to have 2 characters less than your opponent. You're, you want to be playing cards, and your opponent will rarely be significantly faster than you, especially if you're killing their things with Augur or Dock. And so in most cases this doesn't apply, and in most cases the original part doesn't really apply much. The advantage of Liberation is that in the situations where it does apply, it is amazing. The main target here is against green purple Luffy. This hits the 5 cost Sanji and Pudding that otherwise goes to 7 cost using the stage, and lets you kill it efficiently and simultaneously get rid of something like a 4 cost Zoro Jiro, which they often play in combination with it. They have a lot of 4 costs to combine with it, and since they play multiple cards, the common situation is going to be, when you're able to activate this, is you having 1 character and then them having 3. And in that case, you use 6 Dawn to KO 10 Dawn worth of things, and 1 card to KO 2. And in that specific matchup, this is great. And there's some other matchups where it's usable. I would like to note that some people see it and are like, oh, they can see that they can kill 2 things with it. Maybe a 4 cost and a 2 cost or something like that, or a 4 cost and a 3 cost against a deck, an aggro deck that swarms a lot like Rayleigh. And that is bait. Liberation is too slow in those matchups, and it's not efficient enough to justify using what is probably your entire turn while not developing anything. So, Liberation is a very meta-dependent card that only works against very few decks, namely green-purple, and can be included for that particular reason, but is completely dead in every other matchup and is thus a 0 to 1 of card in your deck. Next up, the classic. It's Finger Pistol. Finger Pistol was played more before the 7-cost Teach came out and the KO engine was stronger. It lets you hit a 5-cost unconditionally. It also fills your trash with 3 cards, which is a nice injection for Burgess. And together with Augur, it can hit 8 costs. Just by itself, it can get rid of a lot of priority 5-cost targets like the Cavendish or Carrot, which may otherwise lose you the game. This card can deal with those swiftly. The downside of Finger Gun is that it doesn't develop anything, and so you just kind of go 1 for 1 in cards with your opponent if it does have a good target. And generally you would prefer to use our KO engine because it replaces itself and stays on the board to be used repeatedly. Finger Gun is swift and smooth, and can thus definitely be a strong card to include, especially depending on what matchups you're up against and whether or not you're leaning into the KO engine in the first place. A last thing to note is that the trigger activates it, and an activate main on a 4-cost is insanely strong. Getting this trigger when your opponent has a 5-cost out, especially one they haven't swung with yet, sometimes that's just a mistake because they should swing first to dodge triggers, but other times if it's something like Cavendish where they play the Cavendish to get the Dawn back and then swing, or maybe they have multiple 4 or 5 costs that you can target, kind of similar to the 4-cost Shiryu situation where one attacks and the other one you KO. If you trigger this on a 5-cost, like a smoker, that can win you the game alone, just single-handedly. And that's why one of the reasons why this card is always worth including, just because of the massive threat that the trigger poses. And yeah, in combination, it very quickly gets rid of things that are otherwise that would otherwise require a lot of setup. Generally important to consider. Last and not least in this case is the 4-cost Shiryu, the other one, the activate main Shiryu. 8 KOs a 3-cost. It's also a bit harder to remove on your opponent's turn, which makes it a pain because it takes a lot of effort to remove, but it's not really much of a threat anymore after the original attack, which makes it kind of a nuisance. Consistent 5k swings that eventually your opponent has to deal with, but usually has other things they want to focus on. The Shiryu is great for tempo. Against aggro decks, being able to play card and kill something before it gets a swing. So in comparison to the 4-cost, the blocker Shiryu, for example, because this is your initiative, you can prevent the swing in the first place. You can also use this as an unexpected way to get rid of something like a blocker, like a small blocker that something like Bonnie might play, or protection for other cards like the Tashigi or the Kyoshiro that green plays, or some yellow protection as well. This card works great against all of those. The strength of this card is tempo against low cost cards. It's recoverable with the 5-cost Kuzan and is not that expensive. And unlike removal of something like Black Hole, it leaves you with a body. And that's why this card is always worth considering, and something that very often you're going to want to include as a one-of. Against the higher cost cards, it doesn't do anything, and then it's just objectively better in every way to just play a Burgess, have a Burgess, bring a Burgess back with Kuzan. But against those aggro matchups, this card is amazing and always worth considering. we continue on to the 2k counters. We are going to start with Stronger, for obvious reasons. Stronger has been the default and strongest 2k that Teach has had from the very beginning. That's because for one, it's searchable, and for two, the activate main is actually usable. You can use it to get -2 onto something, and that's basically Desperate Times call for Desperate Measures. You're using one card to do -2, and so it's objectively worse than something like Tempest Kick in that situation, because you don't, because Tempest Kick replaces itself and has a higher reduction. But if you really need to kill something, like you have maybe Augur and Dock, but you really need to get rid of a 5 cost, or you have Augur and Teach, but you really need to kill an 8 cost, Stronger can help you get over that line, or even just to remove a low cost thing with just Stronger and Dock. If you're trying to go for game, for example, and you have your Augur Dock engine, your Dock has been ignored because it's late game and it can't kill anything anyways. So throwing the Stronger out from your hand lets you for 1 Dawn get rid of a blocker and save your Augur swing. So you can go for game much more easily. So Stronger is great. It will always be a 4 of in the Teach, and it's worth keeping in mind that you can use it for its activate main. And if you're planning to use it for its activate main, it can be worth playing it earlier on. So if you just don't have a play on 3 Dawn or whatever you may be on, it can be worth it to just play Stronger if you know you're planning to shoot a specific card that's coming up soon. It does make it more predictable, but your opponent's not going to be able to remove it without wasting resources on the card, and so yep, keep the option in mind, one, to kill stuff, but two, even to just play it earlier, even if it does waste the 2k. The second one, which will also remain absolutely core, is the Caribou from OP11. This card is amazing. This card single-handedly replaced the previous Vasco shot as a cheap blocker and the subpar 3-cost Shiryu 2k. It's not searchable, but a 1-cost blocker is amazing. In your control deck, this can protect your life, but also your higher cost cards. Oftentimes, low cost blockers like this get killed by, cheap removal, but the thing is that a lot of such removal is on play, and this often leaves your opponent with no efficient way of getting rid of this Caribou, to the degree where they may just have to accept, I cannot remove this Caribou, and I will at some point have to do a big swing to force him to block with the Caribou, or hope that he's stupid and uses it to protect something cheaper. And so what this can translate to, even if you drop it earlier, or just drop it later in combination with other things, is that this can equate to a 12 cost to a 12k Teach, because your 10 cost Teach is rested and they can only swing into it, and this little 1 cost wins you the game by just being able to keep your 10 cost alive, keeping your Burgess alive, or just saying, okay, if you do go for game, I will just give you that extra life. This card is amazing. It will probably stay as the core second 2k for Teach for a long time. These two are what you're always going to include, and every base deck list will have these two at 4. And now we get to the two options that you might play if you want to play more than 8 2Ks. The first being the Devon. She's just a worse stronger, basically. That's what she is. She's just a worse stronger. Same effect, -1 instead of -2. You also don't need to trash and draw, but the on KO effect is completely irrelevant because she trashes herself and doesn't kill herself. And so she's just worse. But she's the next best in line, arguably. And so there are some things that she will bring in line into range of the KO engine as if she was stronger, such as 5 costs when you have the Augur Dock. She's just worse. She's a discount stronger. But if you want to go above 8, then she's a solid choice, maybe as a 1 of. And the other option is the new Sabo. He's similar to Caribou in the sense of that alongside being a 2000 counter, he's a cheap blocker. So later on, you can play this as a 3 cost 6000 blocker. Mm, the thing is, he's just worse than Caribou. The 3 cost doesn't really smoothly fit into other plays you want to be making at higher levels when you have the 15 cards in your trash. The 6000 attack is a bit harder to KO, but you're usually trying to use the blockers to stop big swings onto your 10 cost Teach and your Burgess. So you're going to give up the card anyways. He's interesting to consider. There are definitely matchups where being able to block more easily, or where you have the 6 base cost and 6000 attack lets him dodge some removal that would otherwise hit the Caribou. And for 3 cost, he's of course very much worth it at that point. But generally, he's going to stay as a tech option you can consider. So if you want to go, if you have 8 or below, you take these two, and if you want to go above, these are the two you may consider as a 1 or 2 of. Yeah, basically that covers it. Oh yeah, lastly, I wanted to add that the stronger the Caribou will stay on board for a long time, because if you're being efficient with it, you're gonna keep it there. If your opponent doesn't have efficient removal for it, then you're just going to keep it there until you're using it to save your life or to save a Burgess or other tempo that you really need. And since he has 2000 attack, uh, which is actually which is higher than something like the 0 attack Doc Q or the 1000 Lafitte, you can, in the end, if you're short on swings, also use him as a KO threat by attaching 5 Dons, for example, and swinging 7000. It's just something to keep in mind. Next up, we're going to go into some tech options. Um, we're going to start with Black Vortex. Black Vortex is niche in the sense of negating power for the turn and also negating the effect. It's usually not worth it. As a 2 cost 4000 attacker, we usually want to spend all our Dawn, so we don't have time to leave 2 open. We want to be playing our 10 cost Teaches, we want to be playing double Kuzan or Kuzan into Burgess, or just attaching our Dawn to swing. So usually this is dead. However, this is particularly strong against cards that attack multiple times per turn. Zoro. This is good against Zoro. This card single-handedly gives us the upper hand against Zoro. Without this card, the green Zoro matchup would be an almost guaranteed loss, and with it, it is slightly favored for us if we played well. Because he often swings for 8000, and we can negate that, put him back to 4000, and also, even if he swings so high that the Black Vortex isn't enough to counter out of it, we can block, and since we're negating the ability, and it's an activate main and not on attacking, he cannot restand it, and so we can actually use our blocker to defend. We have to be ready of the be wary of the restand event here. For example, if he swings for 12,000 and then uses the extra 3 to restand, but even with the 12,000 swing, this alone puts him to 8,000, and we may be able to counter out of something then. Having Black Spiral makes things a lot more difficult for Zoro. As soon as Zoro drops out of the meta, so will Black Vortex probably, because it's there mostly just for that. It's good also against the 6 cost Rush Luffy that green purple plays, because that too attacks twice per turn. We cannot prevent the double attack because his restand is when attacking, which procs before our counter event. But it does also mean that he still loses the life and the -2 Don to activate the effect. And since green purple generally doesn't have the Don to play it and attach Don, it will swing for 7000, which Black Vortex puts at 3000, and the attack is negated. He will of course then leave the Luffy active, and so we can't swing into it, but the resources your opponent wasted and the certainty that they had that they would now kill you with the double swing from a rusher is lovely. The last use, times where it may be worth doing it, is sometimes you want to prevent abilities of characters due to the nullify. One thing that comes to mind, for example, is the yellow kid leader. At the end of the turn, gives a character blocker and restands it. And when they're balancing how safe they are to you killing them, they generally include, okay, I have this blocker, I have this a blocker with a KO effect, for example, right? Um, but this prevents that, and suddenly they're one blocker short, and suddenly you can just kill them. Uh, yeah. It also works specifically against Gold Roger, the 10 cost rusher, where if your opponent thinks that you're dead because they have 0 life, you have some blockers, but they can just play Roger and kill you. Then after they play Roger, even if they swing right away with Roger, so we don't get to deny the rush, if we can tank that first hit, either by countering or by taking a life if we still have it, then afterwards we can block again and get rid of, and suddenly our board comes back alive and we just win because he committed to game, basically. It should be important to note here that if you try to block and then Black Vortex, you will lose because the when attacking effect procs before the Black Vortex. Most of the time it's dead, but it's definitely the as soon as a deck like Zoro is meta and common, you need to include this at least once. The second tag option I'm gonna cover is the where are we here? Is the 9 cost Kaido. Um, since it's an activate main, you can use it in the deck, and it trashes a 7 cost, which covers a lot, but notably 7 plus 3 is 10, so if you have an Augur or Tempest Kick works since it's 9 done, you can use this to KO a 10 cost. Um, and that is just a very powerful effect because usually people can't replace their 10 costs that easily. And so this just gives you a big swing. Also, for example, in the upcoming Ace matchup, if they on 8 Dawn play their 10 cost and you have your Augur set up, then on 9 you can answer by killing it. And that is a very unexpected move. The downside is that you and your opponent both discard a card, and that's usually worse for you because you are more likely to be running out of cards. And so if both people lose a card, then the person that has less cards left is at a disadvantage, and that's one of the reasons why one of the downsides of this card. The second downside is that it is a 9000k card and thus dies a lot quicker and isn't as much of a threat. And basically, whenever you're considering, do I want to put in Kaido, the question is always, why don't I just put in another 10 cost Teach? 10 cost Teach also removes anything for one turn with the negation. Of course, it's not a permanent effect, but for that turn it has the same effect. And it is after that a 12,000 blocker that also removes a leader ability. And so most of the time you're just gonna say, okay, I prefer Teach. It's searchable. It's stronger in most scenarios. But if we find ourselves in a meta where we do really want to get rid of some 10 costs, or where there may be a situation where your opponent has very few cards in hand, you're up against a deck that also has very little, and so, for example, you know that, okay, your opponent has nothing left except a 10 cost Doflamingo as Bonnie or something, then this card is of course great, because you can snipe out that last card they had. Maybe they have 2 cards left, one of which is a giant, and you force them to drop one, and now they can't use their giant anymore. Also wonderful. So that's what this card is worth considering for. Most of the time though, you're just gonna prefer a 10 cost Teach. And since you're at the moment not running 4, if you want that extra late game, you just add a 3rd or 4th Teach, depending on what you currently have in. A fun little card. Uh, that no one has ever seen or played. Barrier. Mm, Later on, it's a one Dawn 4000, which the main advantage of which is that we don't have a lot of cards later on, and so we don't have a lot of counter power. And people don't expect this. That's kind of a large advantage of it. If you have 2 Dawn open, they might be ready for a Vortex, but they might not be ready for a sudden 8,000 card, 8,000 power gain. So it's worth considering. Um, but it remains niche. It's a brick. It's not searchable. The trigger is nice. It's something to keep in mind that it exists. Mm, yeah, it is a tech option after all. And lastly, I believe I'm going to look at Shockwave. This was played much more commonly earlier on in OP9, uh, OP10 even, but partly just because we had less options. We didn't have the 5 cost Kuzan, we didn't have the starter deck cards, we didn't have the new PRB Shiryu. It's also a 2 Dawn 4000, but lets you KO an active 3 cost, and so it's strong against aggro decks that that you with this you can kind of cover 2 things at once, right? And the trigger is also very strong, but with the same problems of why we don't play Black Vortex normally, and it's only really good against multi-attack things. The 2 Dawn is too slow, and it's too situational. So unless we hit a meta where there's just a lot of aggro with a lot of 3 costs, we will not be playing this again as we were before. That generally covers the tech options. The most relevant one is Black Vortex. This is one you're going to be always considering whether to put in or not, while these are more niche things that are fun to consider. And then lastly, I want to go over some things that may seem like tech options but are actually just bad. Tempting cards where you may wonder, why not play this? And I will explain to you why they're garbage. So, Pizarro, 1 cost 5,000 attack? No. Um, you want to be using your stage. If you have it, you need to get into your trash. You need to find the cards you want. Negating those searches for a cheap 5,000 swing is just not worth it. You would probably rather just discard this. It's weak. It'll get ignored for the on KO effect. It's just bad. Never play this card. Next up, Vasco Shot. He could be considered an actual tech option since he's searchable, but he's generally just worse than the Caribou. And he is also just, if you're going to bring something back with Kuzan or find a blocker to search, you would rather just use one of the bigger ones that give you much more value. So, not played anymore. The Shiryu 2K, he was just played because we didn't have Caribou yet. He does nothing really except being a 2K. He's searchable, but not really worth it. I'm going to ignore the vanillas, there's no point explaining why those suck. Then we have the Rush Burgess. This can seem tempting sometimes because you think, well, what if I just had that extra swing? Maybe what if I had the Kuzan and I could swing with him and then pull out the Burgess? And the answer is efficiency. Um, you can play this card for 5 Dawn and then attach 1 to give him rush. So he's a 6 cost, 7,000 attack. But you could use 6 Dawn to just attach to your various cards and swing much higher without losing a card. He's also a brick and useless in most situations. You want to build your board, not get a cheap 7,000 attack swing off. Don't play this card. Then we have the 10 cost Teach, the promo Teach. The downside of this one is basically just that it's too slow. It doesn't do anything on the turn it's played. There's a certain temptation to it where you say, okay, what if I drop it and then next turn I can swing, negate everything, and use all my 10 Dawn to just go for game. You ignore all blockers, you ignore all leader abilities, and you just probably win the game. And that is tempting, but you need to do something on the turn it's played with a 10 cost. Otherwise, it's just too slow. It's not blocker. It doesn't have any effects. So 10 cost teach is always going to be much more influential on the turn it's dropped. And yeah, if you're ever in a situation where you are able to use this guy's ability to attack, you're already winning hard, and having the 10 cost teach would have worked just as well. And the 10 cost teach is just much better in situations where you're in a more of a balanced or losing game state. If you ever want to add this card, just add another blocker teach. And then the people's dreams don't ever end. Funny card. Um, if you know the top of your card of your deck, you get a big boost, but 5,000 isn't even that big. We saw Barrier just a moment ago, which is 4,000 being way less conditional. You don't have any way to control the top of your deck. We don't have that many 6 cost cards in our deck. We just have the Kuzan and the 7 cost and 10 cost each. So the general chance is very low. The only way you would ever want to use this is if you remembered the order of your cards starting when you first put cards below your deck. So if you go through your entire deck with searchers, then technically you could fully memorize the order of your deck and what card is on top of your deck now. And so that way you could actually know what card is on top of your deck towards the late game. The problem is, even then, you wouldn't be able to freely use it because you would need to wait for a moment where there is one of those higher cost things on top of your deck, on top of which this card trashes it. So even if you did have a high cost card on top of your deck, like a 10 cost each, you probably wouldn't want to trash it. You would just want to wait for it and play it next turn. So while the concept of this card is cool, um, it's too weak. If it didn't trash the top card, or if it gave more power in a level that would justify that type of thing, it would be cool. And the high level genius teach tech, but it's just not. So don't play this card. Uh, yeah. One last thing to consider that I think is very funny, but sadly doesn't work, is negative hollow. For 2, you can trash one card from your opponent's hand. Unfortunately, they choose. And so this is a 1-for-1 basically. Use a card, they lose a card, and you also lose 2 Dawn. And as I explained before with Kaido, that is only worth it if you have more cards than your opponent, which you rarely will. But technically, if your opponent has no cards in hand or only one, then this could snipe that out. And the trigger actually makes it a lot better, but it's not worth it. It's too slow. It's a brick. It's usually bad even if it costs 0. Just hilarious, but don't. And that covers all the tech options and the just bad cards. Next up, general deck building. So we've gone through the various cards by category and some ways that they can be used, some strengths, weaknesses, and now I want to go over some general deck building things. I'm going to show you deck lists afterwards too, but first for general things it's good to know when you're making your own list. The first is that Teach goes through his entire deck at least once in most games. And that translates to a couple of things. The first is that even if you have only a one of a card, you will, over the course of the game, probably find it. Unless you have to trash it, or unless it's in a search with a card that you need more urgently, then you'll have access to cards that are one-offs, which means that you can more reliably add tech options to your deck without having to worry about not finding them if you only add one. Which is why some people, for example, only run one Black Vortex, despite Vortex being absolutely crucial against Zoro. And even important cards can just be a 2 to 3 of. If you have a card you want to play multiple times, like a Burgess or a Teach, you still don't need to play it as a 4 of because you'll find it consistently anyways. Even if you trash one early, like a Teach here, you'll find another one and reliably have a card. If unless you don't prioritize it more than once, you're gonna be fine. Um, the second part of this is that due to stage and leaderability, you'll be constantly trashing cards not even cards you don't want from your hand, but the card that you least need right now from your hand. Especially with stage, you're going to be cycling through a lot. And what that means is that you can get rid of cards you don't need in that matchup. So in, for example, a matchup where I don't need Black Vortex, like, I don't know, Bonnie or something like that, or just a lot of matchups in general, other tech options you might have, maybe you're running Liberation and you're up against any deck that's not green, purple, Luffy, you can just get rid of it without a problem, and it doesn't feel bad to do so. You need targets to trash almost every turn, potentially multiple times per turn, and so there is no such thing as a brick, so to say, in the Teach deck. The only exceptions are if you get a whole bunch of them at once. But yeah, both the first and the second point translate to you being able to put in a lot of tech options as one of, without worrying about not finding them and without worrying about what if I find them in a matchup where I don't need them. The third point is that Teach focuses a lot on countering the enemy game plan. A lot of the time, your game plan is to stop the enemy game plan. The most obvious example of this is the KO engine, where we just consistently try to KO whatever the other person puts out. But our other KO cards, like the Shiryu blocker to stop aggro, also work for this. The other 4-cost Shiryu to KO 3 costs. Blockers to stall. 10-cost Teach, negating important cards. Stuff like Black Hole or Black Vortex, stopping the enemy. And what that means is that when you're building a deck, you need to know what the meta decks are and what they play, and you need to come up with a plan on how you negate their general game plan. And that requires a good amount of thinking. You can, of course, always copy deck lists, but to play them to their full potential, you do need to understand why the cards are in there. Hopefully, the list I gave earlier helps a good amount with that. Uh, um, but when you're building your deck, you need to know what's currently played, the biggest decks, and you need to know how you're gonna stop those game plans if you're working on a more countering side, especially with the KO engine. And those three things together, the cycling, the trashing, and the reactionary style of the deck, mean that the deck lists of Teach can vary greatly based on what's currently meta, based on even your personal preference, based on the approach, and based on the skill of your gameplay. What people have in the deck can vary a lot. Mm, Even for like last 5 cards, you can have the best players disagree on what they should do, on what you should build, and even in a tournament result, you can argue that one was better than the other or one wasn't better than the other. And from one set to another, the list can change dramatically based on the overall game plan that you have in that set. And that brings me to the next point, which is the duality of the Teach deck building. Basically, there's 2 ways to build Teach. The first is what we had when Teach first came out, and it consists of this. Um, we run 4 Burgesses. We try to get Burgess as big as possible, as quick as possible. We drop 1 or 2, maybe even more Burgesses on the board. We protect them and our life with blockers, and then we start dropping 10-cost Teach and start just swinging into everything at ridiculously high values. It's a much more active version of the deck and focuses more on building up your own win condition instead of negating your opponent's. And it is very strong. Um, Because it's a bit more active, it can feel a bit more fun, but that varies on your tastes. The strength of this is greatly dependent on Burgess. Um, and what I mean by that is whether you play this or the other version depends on how easily Burgess can be dealt with and how slow the meta is. So in OP11 and OP12, which we're still in, Blue Purple Luffy is the number one meta deck, and Blue Purple Luffy can bounce the Burgess with the 8 cost Rush Luffy without spending any resources once per turn. And if you're playing, a Burgess version, then you can't even kill the Luffy after he swings that turn, even if you have a big swing, because the 8,000 attack plus giants means you would need to swing ridiculously high, spend your entire turn doing it, and you would probably still fail. And so a Burgess heavy deck loses by default to blue purple. Green Zoro can rest it, Rayleigh can ignore it because the tempo is fast. And so the strength of the Burgess and blockers or Burgess and Blackbeard deck style depends fully on how easily Burgess can be dealt with by the current meta decks. And if they can't, then this version may be, Turbo Burgess may be the way to go. The other option, which we're currently playing, is the KO engine version, and this one is good for one if Burgess isn't working, and for two if you need those instant effects, the instant effect that the characters have when they're dropped on board. For the right away KO, Docu is great against low cost aggro, against the one cost that Rayleigh in particular has, and for replacing itself. So if Burgess doesn't work very well, then you go for the KO variety. If the meta is very aggressive, you go for the KO variety just because of Docu and Augur, even if the 7 cost teach is a bit slow. But if you have a bit more time and Burgess isn't removed as easily, then Burgess is probably the better way to go. It should be noted that in both cases, you're going to be running the Augur and the Burgess a couple of times, because even in the KO version you want the threat of the Burgess because he's still strong, and even in the Burgess variety you're still playing KO cards. Augur specifically is just a great target, and even though you may not run him a 4 of, 3 of is still absolutely worth including. Docu can be worth including for that early aggro decks that you may need to deal with, and the 7 cost teach can still be a great value card, but the amount of each that you would put in would go down drastically, and you do have more space in the Burgess list because you drop all 4 Tempest Kicks. You probably cut down Teach from 3 to maybe 2 or 1 or nothing. Augur from 4 to 3, Doc from 4 to 2. It depends on the details, but it's important to be aware of that duality of the Turbo Burgess versus KO engine, and based on the meta to see what you want to go for. If you do kind of a wishy-washy mix, it probably won't be as strong as leaning into either direction. On top of that, currently KO is better. As I said, whether you go Burgess or KO engine depends on the meta, and the current meta dictates you have to go for the KO engine. Blue-purple is too strong, Doc is too good against Rayleigh to ignore it. The 7 cost teach gives good value, and and Zoro also kind of deals well with Burgess, which means that the 3 main meta decks are all not that bothered by Burgess, and the KO engine works quite well against them. So at the moment, you want to be going for a variety with this and lean into that. However, in OP13, it looks like that might change due to KO immunities, a dropout of blue-purple, the 10 costs an ace. But overall, to summarize again, when you're building a teach deck, things to keep in mind. 1, you're going to see all of your deck. 2, you can get rid of cards you don't need without losing any value from it. and those add up to a lot of flexibility for adding one-offs and tech options. And 3, it's a reactive deck, so pay attention to the meta and how you're going to be answering your opponent's game plan. 4, the duality between Burgess deck focus and a KO engine deck focus. And lastly, just the note that currently the KO version is better. Now is the next part of the deck building, and the last part I'm going to actually give an example or two. The first is my current deck, OPO12 after the PRB set. As you can see, I have the KO engine focus for docks, for augurs. I have 2 of the 7-cost teach and also 3 Tempest kicks. I have 2 Shiryu blockers against the Rayleigh and another 4-cost Shiryu against Rayleigh and also Bonnie. This helps against quite nicely. Can also be good against the blue-purple Zoro or green-purple Zoro. Shiryu is also nice against those. I don't have Liberation, it's not worth it. 1 black hole just to deal with situational things that may need to be removed suddenly, or also just to go for game when negating a blocker, whether it's a 5-cost Nami, 8-cost Mihawk. This also gets rid of 1 very annoying card in the Zoro matchup. Yokimaru or so. 2 black vortexes for Zoro. 1 Devon as the other as the 3rd blocker, just to have the option and to have the double attack threat. I'm at 8 2Ks. I already explained why these are going to be the ones. I went to 2 Kuzans. Just nice value overall to have. 3 Burgesses. Don't need all 4 at the moment, but going below 3 hurts a bit, and it does become a threat in most games. 2 My Ages just to make space, especially for Tempest Kick. They're very kind of similar effect. 1 done, replace themselves. Tempest Kick just has the cost reduction, but doesn't search as much. Yeah, so that would be an example of a deck list. I think there's a very solid deck list. I win locals pretty consistently with this, and this is also the deck list I use on the sim. So that gets me to about 3.4 billion or so. So pretty high up there. That's kind of what I use. But as an alternative, for example, how one might build a different deck list. In this deck list, I've cut down the Burgess to 2, just kind of further leaning away from that and further leaning into a KO approach. 2 Shiryus instead of just 1. I cut the 5-cost blocker, and this will be enough. But there's an extra 7-cost teach and 4 Tempest kicks instead of 3, just to fully, as much as possible, lean into the KO engine against blue-purple, and kind of hope that the 2 Burgess will be consistent enough to find and bring back if it is needed. Yeah, those are current deck lists. If you want to copy one, I would suggest this one for now. If you want to change anything, you can consider the deck building. I'm going to talk a bit about the current general plan on a vague level. First, just to start, 1 to 4 done. Ideally, we want to get our stage to start cycling, finding the cards we need, getting cards in our trash, setting up things for Kuzan. We want to bring out Doc Q and Lafitte as searchers and pseudo blockers, potentially not using Doc to set up for an Augur KO, just for the stars of our KO engine. We will take the first hit onto our life, unless we're against a very aggro deck, and we will play a 4-cost activate main Shiryu on curve if we can, especially if we're going second. It is a very smooth answer to whatever 3-cost they play. Generally though, the other 4 costs aren't as nice to play on curve because they don't give as much tempo. For the mid game, 5 to 9 Dawn, we're trying to set up our KO engine, move from Dock to the 7-cost Teach, play the Augurs, and use it to KO whatever your opponent plays. Protect it with counter if you can, of course only Augur and Teach, and replay parts of the engine that you may have back in your hand if they do manage to kill something. Whatever you're playing, whether it's Burgess or Augur or a blocker, always use Kuzan to play them just to get an extra card and to potentially get a free swing if you leave the Kuzan on board for a turn. Keep swinging into the board, defending yours and playing blockers. You can counter somewhat aggressively here sometimes if you know that the board control will let you transition into teaches in the end game and win. Which gets us to the late game. We want to drop 10 cost teach whenever possible, whenever we have a nice high cost target to stun and we have other things on board for him. We want to bring out Burgesses, which are now going to be bigger. We want to bring blockers to stabilize, to support our Burgess and 10 cost teach. And then we were aiming to close the game with big swings and black hole that are just very, very difficult to counter out of unless you have Gum Gum Giant or a lot of blockers. Curves. So whether you go first or second as a starting point depends a bit on what type of deck you're playing. But if you're playing the KO engine, as I mentioned earlier, you probably want to go first, and that is what you're doing in the current meta. The ideal play on turn 1 is just playing stage, or alternatively the Lafitte. Age is also nice, but not as good as the others. Tempest if you've got no other options. Caribou as a setup can be nice if you know your opponent doesn't have an efficient way to get rid of it. And then last, if necessary, you can play a stronger in preparation to KO an important card that's coming up soon. For example, if you have a Cavendish that you know might be coming in and you need that extra cost reduction. On 3, the best play is a double Lafitte. If you set up the Lafitte turn 1 and then on turn 2 activate it, find another Lafitte, play it, rest it. So now that you have 2 pseudo blockers and your opponent can't get rid of them both in one turn unless they played a low cost character, which we can hopefully prevent by playing leader ability after the first Lafitte. And alternatively, if they did play a dock, if they did play a 1 cost, then instead of playing a second Lafitte, we play a dock to KO the 1 cost and thus remove any cheap removal, and again he has 2 pseudo blockers to deal with. And if that doesn't work, then we just swing, but that again is not optimal. 5, we have nicer options again. We have the 5 cost Kuzan, and we have Augur. Ideally we play Kuzan into whatever we wanna play, and if we don't need the cost reduction KO right away, we can leave the Kuzan on the field to get a free swing next turn, and then grab the Augur for the KO effect. Another option is to play a blocker or a Burgess in combination with a 1 cost. Again, if you don't have something right away, the 1 cost have space to be squeezed in here or there. At 7, we want to play our 7 cost Teach, hopefully with our Augur set up so we can KO whatever 6 cost they played last turn. Another solid option is playing Kuzan and Dock if you turn the Kuzan into an Augur, so you can get a KO engine in one turn and shoot a 4 cost. It's not as efficient as Teach, especially if you already have an Augur on board. You can also just play Kuzan or Augur and swing. 7k swings are nice a lot of the time, but it's not as nice. And you can also play Kuzan and 1 costs, but that's unlikely. This also applies to the 6 cost Kuzan and 1 cost, but rarely will it be the best way to go. We get to 9. The best play there generally will be Kuzan and a 4 cost. Kuzan can bring us back an Augur for the engine or already start focusing on Burgesses. And then we combine it with another Burgess, a blocker. Generally you want to go for balance here, so if the 4 cost that you're playing is a Burgess, then you want to grab a blocker with the Kuzan, and the other way around. Next up and suboptimal is playing the 7 cost Teach and 1 costs if you didn't manage to play him on 7 Dawn. It's not as nice, it's not as smooth on curve, but it still works to get the engine back up and running. And then if none of that works, then you just play one of the 2 Kuzans and use the rest to swing into things. At this point in the game, there's at least going to be rested characters for you to swing into, so it's not as bad, but still not optimal. We move on to the even curve. So at 2, we want to play stage ideally and another 1 cost. If that doesn't work, a dock is nice to set up and have ready for the upcoming turn, even though on 4 we cannot play the auger. And then the Lafitte. On the even curve, the Lafitte is worse than stage because we don't get that smooth setup of activating 2 at the same time. So if on 2 we play Lafitte, we rest him, he's always going to die. Because your opponent on 1 Dawn probably played a 1 cost, he will also just get killed for that. So it's not nearly as effective as it would be if you're going first. On 4, the Shiryu or Burgess are nice cards to have, just to get them out early for Burgess, and the activate main Shiryu is a perfect curve to follow up on your opponent's 3 cost. If you can't do those things, then Dock and 1 cost also works. Maybe you didn't have the time to play Dock last turn, maybe you just found him because of stage or draw. It still works, and at least next turn you're gonna be able to combine the Dock with the Augur. 6. We can play the Kuzan or Augur into a 1 cost. We just have that extra Dawn. And if we don't have that, we just play the 6 cost Kuzan. And if we don't have that, we can also play 4 cost and swing for 7k. Suboptimal, but it's still something. For 8, we would play Teach, the 7 cost, and again we'd have 1 Dawn left for something like a 1 cost, which usually feels bad, but occasionally can be worth it if you can squeeze in something like a Caribou here to protect your rested engine. Alternatively, it's possible to play 2 4 costs, especially if one of them is Burgess, that brings 2 characters on the board at once, and if you're stable enough and your trash is filling up nicely, that 1 to 2 Burgesses can actually be quite a nice swing. And if those don't work, then you can have the Kuzan and swing option. It's just awkward that after the 5 cost, Kuzan, the extra 3 don't really work into anything. Same applies for the 6 cost Kuzan. And then on 10, we have a lot of options. The easiest one is the 10 cost Teach. We want to get these out whenever we can, but sometimes the board state isn't right for it. Maybe we don't have enough cards. Maybe your opponent has too many individual things and we don't. So if that's the case, double Kuzan is the best play. Double 5 cost Kuzan draws us 2 cards, gets 2 things onto the board, probably a Burgess and a blocker, maybe 2 Burgesses, and it's just a lot at once. If we can't do either of those things, Kuzan and a 4 cost and a 1 cost can also be strong, although it does eat through a lot of your hand. And if we can't have that, double 4 cost and a Lafitte can work. And if we're going for game, then just black hole into swinging for game works. Potentially first something like Lafitte to find the black hole, and then use it, and then swing. And if none of those work, you can just play a blocker and swing with the things you have on board. It's slow, but if your board is established enough, that works just fine. Especially if you're running out of cards in hand and need to trash something and have nothing great to play. For searching, trashing, and tips, first of all, early on we're trying to find searchers, obviously, but also the KO engine and the Kuzan to make it all better by giving us extra cards. Then in the specific matchups there may be cards that you really need, and that's also where you start looking for these, such as Black Vortex against Zoro, Black Hole against a yellow deck potentially, or 10 cost Teach if you're playing against something like Bonnie that will be slow and you need those 10 costs. You also want to get at least 1 blocker and Burgess in the trash to have as options for Kuzan to bring back. The blocker especially is important to have the option, because it's painful to be able to grab back anything and then you realize you have 20 cards in your trash but nothing to protect you with. Later on, the Kuzan is still a priority to find. He's always good at any stage, but also the 10 cost Teach becomes relevant, the Burgess and blockers and Black Hole. And then on the other side, for the trash, early on we want to trash the 10 cost, also the 7 cost Teach. They're just bricks, you're not going to play them soon. Any Kuzan targets that you're going to be bringing back in a moment, like trashing Augur, so that you can bring him back with Kuzan. And also any events you may have that you just don't have planned targets for, whether it's a black hole, finger pistol, tempest kick, If you know there's nothing directly coming up with those, get rid of them. They're bricks, they're useless. Later, we're gonna trash dock as an early part of the engine, and other searchers, age, and stage are also not as useful anymore. The 7 cost teach has a short window where you want to play him, but then once you're back at 10 cost, you also just have things you'd much rather do. So you trash the teach when you can. And also, as soon as you have one 7 cost teach, he can also bring himself back if you really need to. So if you play one, even if he's a good card in that matchup, just get rid of any additional ones. And you reach a point where you have very few cards in hand, and your goal for every turn is either teach or 5 cost Kuzan. And so at that point, trash everything that is not Kuzan or teach or black hole when you're going for game. And also, don't trash more than 1 to 2 teaches. This generally applies to any card that you're going to need in that matchup at some point. So in a very aggressive game, you may be able to trash all of your teaches, but usually, even when it's not important early, you want to have 1 to 2 teaches as an option later in the game. And also, if you're up against a specific matchup where you know that at the moment a card is useless, but you only have 1 in your deck and you need it later, don't greed, don't trash it early, keep it safe. I wanted to talk a bit about the different matchups that are currently popular. However, the video is already 2 hours long, and the detailed guides on these 5 in total would take about another 2 hours. So I'm going to release them in a separate video within the next couple of days. I wanted to give some general notes on teach matchups overall, and one thing I would like to say is that against almost any matchups, if you play it a solid amount better than your opponent, you will win or have a good chance of winning. And Teach's leader ability works as a good equalizer to slow down other decks. So the game generally is going to be slower, even if that doesn't necessarily win you the game. For example, green purple Luffy has on plays on almost everything, yet even without those, it's still incredibly strong against us. But if we play well enough, even just a bit better than our opponent, almost any matchup will be between 45 and 55% win rate. So if you do lose against something, a difficult matchup, don't just blame it on the matchup. There's a good chance that you could have played it better and that you could have won if you did. So that's just one last thing to keep in mind. As an addition, I will make a mini summary on each of the matchups, but it's better to look at the full guide. For Blue Purple Luffy, build up your KO engine, go first, later ability starting at 9, try to KO the things he drops, and finish with 10 cost Luffy, 10 cost Teach. Green Purple Luffy, turn off on plays the entire game, go first, kill Sanji Pudding as soon as possible, and then try to go for game. Zoro, go for board, find Black Vortex as much as possible, and be careful of Deadman's Game. Rayleigh, use Duck Q to get rid of his 1 costs and eat swings, use the 4 cost blocker Shiryu to gain tempo and life, and try to work towards killing him before he can kill you over the course of 2 turns using his unblockable event. 5. Bonnie, a very favorite matchup. Go first if you're using the KO engine, and second if you're going on a Burgess heavy deck. Turn off on play starting at 5, and use your teach later to stop her leader ability and big drops like the 8 cost kid. Next up, common Blackbeard mistakes, and there are quite a few. First of all, incomplete enemy knowledge allowing for powerful on plays. This is standard, it's been mentioned a couple of times before by me here, knowing the enemy deck list, and the most obvious way to do that is to forget that your opponent has a strong on play and have it mess up your board when you just weren't sure if you needed to trash or not. The opposite side of this is when you don't know the enemy deck well enough and you use leader ability every turn because you're scared of on plays that potentially don't exist or potentially aren't that scary, and then you've run out of cards and lack the cards that you need to counter out or play. Then swinging with blockers that leave you vulnerable. Sometimes swinging with blockers is the right move, but other times you need it to protect key cards or your life. Maybe you need the 6 cost Kuzan to be able to block so you can make sure he procs his on KO effect. Same for the 4 cost Shiryu. This applies to any deck, but not realizing that enemy lethal is possible with the right cards. You may feel comfortable having blockers up, and you counted the enemy swings, but you didn't calculate that they have rushers or something to remove your blockers. Same vein, just the opposite, not realizing you have lethal now. Teach can have big swings on the board, and it can be tempting as a control deck to keep tunneling in on KOing your opponent's things. But with the 8k from the 7 cost, the 12k from the 10 cost Teach, and potentially bigger Burgesses, if we just attach Dawn to swing and KO, we can often just go for a kill, and that can be easy to miss. Another classic is to not trash first to buff Burgess when relevant, so sometimes Burgess is one card away from buffing up to the next level, but we're just in a habit of using leader ability at the end of the turn, because that's usually when you want to do it, to give your opponent less information, but you lose out on a 1k of a swing, which could equate to eating one more card from your opponent's hand, or killing something that otherwise wouldn't die. So if you're going to swing with Burgess, remember to check, can I buff him up first? Next up, using your stage or leader ability to trash a solid card when you know you're going to play Kuzan. So you may have a hand with a couple of options, and all of them are things you kind of want to have. Maybe a 10 cost Teach and you're closing in on 10 Dawn, some counters, a blocker, and you need to trash something with stage because you want to search. And so you decide, okay, I'll get rid of the 2 cost, but you know you're going to play the Kuzan, and then you play Kuzan, grab what you want, and then you realize, oh, now I drew a brick. I should have just waited. And yeah, that's the thing to keep in mind. If you're going to play Kuzan, use the effect first so you have an additional target to potentially trash. The trashing too much is something I mentioned with getting rid of teaches, but it's an easy mistake to make. A classic and painful one is forgetting to trash your Kuzan target. You're doing your math, you're looking at, okay, I'm gonna Kuzan, I'm gonna grab an Augur, then I'm gonna play the Strong from hand and combine it with 7 cost Teach to KO this or that, or this, I'm just gonna grab the Shiryu, whatever it may be, and then you actually make the play, and you play the Kuzan and you trash it, and you realize the Augur's still in my hand. And now your entire play is messed up, and if your enemy is generous, they'll let you take it back, but that's at a local and not at a higher level. So always make sure if you need something to grab with Kuzan, double check to make sure it's ready in your trash. 6 cost Kuzan you can mess up by blocking too early and giving the rested target that you play out as a vulnerable victim to swings, most notably if you play 5 cost Kuzan out of it, and alternatively grabbing the wrong target with the Kuzan, because sometimes you want to just grab the Burgess, sometimes you want to grab the 5 cost Kuzan, and sometimes you may even want to grab something like a Devon. We get to a second page of all these mistakes. These ones all in one go, sadly. Dropping 10 cost Teach when smaller card and swinging is more effective, somewhat obvious. Not considering rushers or other events that allow it lethal, I mentioned this a little bit before. If you use your leader ability a lot and then also counter everything you can, you're going to run out of cards quickly, and then it catches up to you. Carrying 1 cost with Dog is tempting, but sometimes it's the wrong play, because you might want to make sure that your Dog is ready to use with your engine. Playing stage late into the game can be tempting, especially if you're looking all game for it, but it's a -1 at that point, and rarely worth it. You may also have a lot on board, Big Burgess, Teach, whatever, and game just looks like it's in range, and often it is, but sometimes there's no need to risk it, and you can just play another 10 cost Teach, swing the free swings you have, go for board with what you have, and just finish it next turn. Don't get greedy if you don't need to be. Another classic is to assume your opponent will make a specific mistake, hoping that they will not see a misplay that you made, or hoping that they won't notice that they can rest this or that and then have game. That might work against weaker opponents, but it will not help you get better as a player, and you should always assume that your opponent will play things perfectly, and then react to misplays after that. More specifically, forgetting about an enemy black vortex and not using leader ability first. So if your opponent has 2 down open, you swing, they activate black vortex, negate your leader ability. Now you can't turn off on plays, and then in the next turn they hit you with big on plays that win them the game. Just important to keep in mind, if you're playing against black and they have 2 down open, use your leader ability first. And lastly, not using your leader ability before swinging against life when the enemy deck has summon triggers. These are things like the 2-cost Nami. They will just have, trigger, play this card, and then that card itself will have an on play. Something like Lilith from Vegapunk also applies here. So you just want to make sure, if you're up against that sort of deck, just as a routine, use leader ability before swinging. We continue on to great versus good teach players. These are just some extra things that separate the best from the rest. And some of these you may already do, some of these may seem optional, but they're just things to keep in mind that go above common mistakes. First, full knowledge of enemy decklist and threats. Even of off-meta things, you're gonna run consistently into things that are not the main decks, and a great teach, will still know exactly when he needs to use his leader ability and what he needs to be careful of. A great teach will also know when to allow on plays, despite the enemy having some on plays that may be somewhat strong, just so that they can minimize leader ability usage. And you do that by comparing the strength of the on play compared to the strength of the play without the on play effect, and the chance of that happening compared to what they don't have to. And sometimes even powerful on plays can be worth risking if the chances are right, if you're in a desperate situation where you just need to hope they can't. That is an extra step. Refine and flexible deck list. It's just very important to be up to date on the meta and to adjust based on it, and not getting stuck in your comfort zone. Playing around enemy win conditions is generally, of course, important, but great teach players will just do it as effectively as possible, working around whatever they can work around, and working into the most likely case if they can't fully work around everything. Noticing lethal in 1 is one thing, but noticing lethal in 2 is a step further, where you notice that with enough swings now, your opponent can't clear enough of your board, and you can just kill him next turn, or you know that even if your whole board gets cleared, you have your leader swing and they don't have blockers. Just being ready for that is important because it's easy to let slip. Sometimes you also need to realize that if your opponent has a certain card, such as Dead Man's Game for green decks, you lose in any way, in either situation, no matter which way you play. And when that is the case, you just have to assume that they don't have it and play as if they don't. And if you get too stuck on considering options that are impossible for you to win anyways, then you will lose games that might have otherwise been winnable. You can also deduce enemy hand cards based on their plays and counters. Now, the counter part is a general part of One Piece, but in Teach you have the specific subcategory where your opponent will play or will not play cards with on-play effects when you have your leader ability active. And from that you can deduce what other on-plays they may or may not have. So for example, if you leave on-plays open and they play a non-on-play card, that suggests strongly that they do not have an on-play at that dawn that they want to play. So you may be more likely and more free to not use your leader ability the following turn again. In a similar vein, if you do turn off on plays and they still play on play effect cards, it's likely that they have further ones in hand and you should keep turning off on plays. second page because there's so many things. Um, you need to be aware of every removal and every rusher the enemy can have. This is of course part of the decklist aspect, but especially those core cards and playing around it is crucial. The next step is keeping track of how close the cards you've cycled are to the top of your deck, what you haven't seen yet, and what will be in life. So since Teach goes through a lot of his deck and circles through a lot of his deck, meaning that you activate your stage, you see three cards, you pick one and two, then go under the deck. And after that first search goes through, you know at the bottom of your deck are those two cards and the order they're in, and you know how many cards it's going to be until you get to those cards. So technically, after you've gone through your deck once, you should know the perfect order of all the cards that are coming up in your deck. Now, that is close to impossible to do. And so, similar to card counting to be more efficient, what you can at least focus on is remembering where your 10 cost teaches are, where your 5 cost Kuzans are, and also after the first cycle through your entire deck, to be aware of what cards are going to be in your life. Because being aware of those things allows you to make much more accurate plays and makes it seem like you're just getting super lucky when the reality is you just know what's coming up and can play around it. Next up, fully calculating out lethal. That's easy against decks that don't have any Dawn open, that don't have a lot of life left, that don't have blockers, not a lot of cards in hand. But the more factors get added, the more complicated it is. And as you still have the option to get through a lot in one turn when you have multiple big bodies, it's still necessary that you calculate out in detail if you have a guaranteed lethal and in which order you should swing to guarantee that happens. So an easy example is there are many triggers that can rest or bounce, for example, Burgess, and so it can be important to swing with that first. You have your double attack, how do you implement it and when do you swing with it? Your opponent has Giant and a Dawn open. How do you first swing to bait out the Giant? What can you do? Your opponent may have an extra life trigger. How do you get around it and force them to either die or use too much so that they cannot kill you? Great Teach players will just have a plan against each matchup. So overall, there is the idea to negate the enemy game plan, but that does require you to know the enemy game plan and know how exactly you're going to stop it. And the extra step is that you're still flexible based on what cards you and your enemy hit. Because you're trying to negate a game plan, but if your opponent doesn't hit the right cards, then you don't need to answer that problem and you can play differently. So for example, if your green purple Luffy enemy doesn't actually hit Sanji and Pudding, you lose that priority and need to not be lost. And similarly, if you don't find your answers, you need to adjust your game plan to see what you can do to still win. For example, you don't find your 5 cost Augur in time. The easy bonus, if you're great, you just make less mistakes. I over exaggerate here, you never make zero mistakes, even the best mess up sometimes, but of course you want to cut that amount down. Teach requires a lot of thought, things like leader ability against what am I playing against, what cards may they have, what cards will come as an alternative. The more you play Teach and the more often you go through those exact situations, the faster you're able to make that decision. So that you only need to think 10 seconds about whether or not you need to use your leader ability here, whether compared to thinking a whole minute, comparing the ups and downs, just because the great Teach player has already gone through that thought process multiple times and can now do it quicker, which is specifically important for Teach because we often lose in overtime. That is because, for one, as a control deck, we often lose life early and then make our comeback onto the enemy life relatively late. On top of which, if we end up in a tie for life, we will almost always have the smaller deck and lose the tiebreaker. And that's why it's especially important on Teach to be able to make those decisions a bit faster. Lastly, when you're playing in tournaments, especially regionals, where you're playing up to 10 games in a row, you need to be in a good mental and physical state to think and calculate multiple games in a row without getting tired, without stressing, and without just draining and playing worse. And for that, it's important that, especially on those days, you sleep enough, you're hydrated, you eat enough, you're not too stressed. And that can be easy to forget that such a simple concept as just having some water with you at the tournament is something that can set you apart and give you that extra win. We move on to how to improve. So obviously I've given a lot of advice, tips, and information over the course of the video already, but I wanted to give some more practical ways how you can actually implement this. The first self-referential is, of course, rewatch the video, remember the video, take some notes on stuff that stood out to you, uh, and just put it into practice. That's obviously going to help. Next up, play on the sim, the OP bounty sim in particular. If you keep winning, you get into the billions like in Baroque works, and then you start playing better opponents and you start playing against the meta and people that are competent at playing those meta decks. And what that means is that you can get around the high variance of the skill and deck lists of your opponents at locals and practice for a more consistent level for something you might face at regionals and other tournaments. Um, yeah, the sim also lets you record games and look at them afterwards and just gives you a comfortable and peaceful kind of environment where you can both practice and learn. Next up, if you're back in real life, play against yourself or a friend is probably better with open cards. This is generally useful, but for Teach in particular, it lets you compare when would you have used the leader ability and when wouldn't you? And then you compare it with your opponent's hand and you see, for example, I use a lot of leader ability when my opponent doesn't even have anything. And then maybe you start to practice and internalize and that you can use leader ability a bit less, ideally, if you can figure out exactly why you're misjudging this. It's good practice for you and your opponent, so I can highly recommend it. Ideally, go back and look at your games, whether win or loss, and find out what you could have done better. This is easiest on the sim because you have replays, but also if you record your games, that technically works. It's easy to write off the wins as being done, but most likely you still made a mistake or many, but just won anyways, either due to your opponent mistakes or due to the matchup or draw luck, whatever it may be. But it's very rare that you have a game that you played perfectly. So keep searching, keep finding, and you'll find games where you lost that you could have won, but of course also games where you lost, but you still could have played better and improved your chances of winning. Next up, watch high-level Blackbeard games and Decklists. Decklists are always easy to copy, but the games as well, especially if you pause while watching the games, you can look at, hey, what would I do now? And then compare it to what the player actually does and how it plays out. Now, you don't need to copy them one for one. Neither they nor I are perfect at the game, nor omniscient as to how the game will play out and what the enemy has. But it's still very important to try and understand why they did something and why what they did worked or didn't work. A little easy one is when you are playing online on the sim, look up the enemy deck lists. It just makes things easier. You're up against Green Zoro, you look up Green Zoro deck lists, and then you see, okay, um, he has the he has the Perona Searcher on play, he has the 5-cost Tashigi, and the 8-cost Mihawk. Those are the main things, so I'm going to turn off on play starting at 5 Dawn. And so whenever you do that, also against off-meta decks, you manage to avoid that moment where you completely whiff and let your opponent play a strong on play. And also, as you do it again and again, you start to internalize the list and you start to not need to look it up anymore, which is, of course, very useful when you actually get to real life tournaments because you can't look up deck lists during a regional game. Lastly, I'm going to be dropping more Teach content soon, so subscribe and you'll get some of those. general things I have planned coming up soon are guides for more off-meta matchups. Also, the OP13 set is coming out soon, and I'm going to make a new guide for the lists and the matchups then. And lastly, I will also just drop nice little gameplay videos, just extended amounts of, you know, games against Blue Purple Zoro with commentary, maybe, of course, hand selected to pretend like I always win, but you get the gist. Lastly, conclusion. First of all, thanks. Thanks for watching the video, especially if you watched all of it. I'm impressed by your attention span. Um, yeah, and I hope you enjoyed it. Teach is a very difficult and complicated, but a very rewarding and satisfying deck as a result. And so it's just very fun to play. You do need to learn deck lists of both your opponent and yours, and be ready for them, and adjust your deck list based on the current meta. If played well, due to its complexity and nature of slowing down the enemy, this deck has a good chance against almost any deck if you play it well enough. A great Teach player will win against a mediocre player of even a bad matchup pretty consistently, and so it's never fully lost. Lastly, this took a lot of time and effort. You can see the length of the video itself, and much more time went into creating it than eventually came out. So like if you learned something, share if you learned multiple things, and subscribe for upcoming Teach content. I'm even going to shamelessly drop a cheap Patreon in the comment, just if you feel like it, because of course this is, as far as I know, the most extensive and longest Teach guide that is for free available anywhere. So if it helps you get that extra winner card, or if you just appreciate the effort, give me $1 or so. And thanks.